everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. I'm here with Tristan in a little office space in our WeWork headquarters in Washington, D.C. Going to be joined in just a quick minute by Tim Lewis of Hadaway Communications to talk about storytelling for good and specifically talking about evaluating. How do we know if the stuff we're doing is working? Our colleague Gabby Ferris is on our Twitter handle at ComNetwork Events, I believe is where she is. She might be at the ComNetwork. In any event, you can join us not only in the webinar tech guide. Hey Maria, hey Yasmin, hey Chiara, hey Alyssa, Andrea, everybody, Dietland, Edith, John, Trishna, Rebecca, Stephanie, Kim, others who are dialing in saying hello. We're going to chat with each other throughout the next hour or so that we'll be together, but we'll also, again, as I was saying, we're on Twitter, so don't make Gabby feel too lonely. She's at the hashtag ComNetLive. That's hashtag ComNetLive. And if over the course of the next little while we have any tools or resources, links to things, we love to make Gabby sort of an online scavenger hunt, but you can probably find those links available there. So keep an eye on it. As I mentioned, we're going to be joined once again by Tim Lewis of Hadaway Communications. If you've been with us for the last, in the previous episodes of this series that we've been doing on storytelling for good, you know Tim. He's fantastic. And today we're going to talk about, again, evaluating the work that we're all doing as storytellers. How do you actually know when you're making a difference? So how do you develop metrics and other things of that nature? We talked a little bit about the logistics. We're going to take your questions throughout the presentation. You guys have already figured it out. Lisa and Stephen, Kate, Sandy, Blair, Tamara are all online here. You guys can chit-chat with each other and with us, ask your questions in that chat box there. And as always, we will be recording this webinar. We always do. So we'll post it up at the ComNetwork website, comnetwork.org, within the next day or two. And with that, why don't I get out of the way and let Tim take over and drive for a little bit. Let's talk about evaluations. All right? Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. For those of you who have been, like Sean said, with us from the beginning, we appreciate it. We really love doing this. We really care about the work that you all are doing. We believe in the power of storytelling and strategic communications, and so it's a pleasure for us to be here and to be with you all, and we appreciate your participation and engagement. This is, as Sean said, the last module in the Storytelling for Good platform that is available at storytelling.comnetwork.org. And we've been walking you through how to tell the story of your organization, and then how to also tell specific stories about the work that you do and the people that are impacted by that work. And all of those resources, again, are available on that website to help you understand some of the best practices from all sorts of research that we've done on storytelling and distribution and engagement. And so we're ending this one thinking about how you evaluate those efforts. And so we're gonna give you some ideas for how to do that. And I'm drawing on both storytelling and evaluation ideas and also just general communications evaluation. When we do this portion of our workshop in person, we often make this section a conversation because, as you know, evaluation metrics can change quickly due to the nature of storytelling media and communications media. And there's also no one-size strategy to fit every individual and every organization. A lot depends on your specific goals and your organizational structure and capacity. And so when we're working with our clients, we like to keep all of that in mind. And so the way that I've structured today's webinar is to sort of try to imitate as much of a conversation as possible, and to help you think through those things, your goals, your organizational structure and capacity, and what you can do to evaluate your work in line with those things. So the first thing I want to do, for those of you who are seasoned communications pros, this might be a little bit of old information for you, but I wanted to keep in mind that we might have some folks who are new to this joining us. And so I wanted to walk through some key terms and definitions that you'll hear today, and that can just generally be helpful in terms of the work that you do. So analytics, I'm sure even if you haven't heard it in your work, you've heard it in life because of our data-driven society. This is, of course, the discipline looking at data, whatever data you have available, and trying to make meaning from it, trying to understand what it tells you about whatever it is that's being measured. And specifically, this is about the statistics often that describe and track and predict the performance of whatever it is you're working with quantitatively. Engagement, this is one of those words that can have multiple meanings, and we used it previously to talk about how to get your stories out to your audiences and to get them to take certain action around your story. Still means that. Here we talk more specifically about the actions that an audience can take in response to your content, both online and offline. I want to stress that we say one of the most important things is a real human being showing up. So, and of course, telling the stories of real human beings as well. So while the digital content and the storytelling you do is crucial and important, you can also be thinking about the ways in which your stories and your communications can bring people together, real people together, to do something tied to their passions. KPIs, again, this is probably a familiar term for many of you. This is key performance indicators, which are measurements that help identify and track progress toward your goals. And then metrics are the numbers that represent the reach and the amount of engagement that you're receiving for a particular communication or story. So one of the first questions that we get when we go down this road is, if I can get it to click up for you. Okay, so what should social impact organizations consider when setting storytelling KPIs? So digital storytelling metrics and KPIs should really be set with a desired impact in mind. And if you were with us for the strategy portion of this webinar series, you'll know that we outline this in that module, in the strategy module. And they should really be in line with the goals of the organization. So some of those that you might have yourself are raising money, building awareness of your brand, raising awareness of an issue, increasing engagement, recruiting volunteers, attracting members, something as big and important as changing public policy or changing attitudes or behavior that can influence really all of these things. So when you're setting that key performance indicator, this is really the place to start. And you want to think about those goals, and you want to think about a specific thing that you can measure around the storytelling component of that goal or the communications in general. So, for example, let's say you are drafting your Kpi statement, and it might read something like this. I want to know if my supporters are sharing information about an issue with their social networks. So to do that, I will determine if people are sharing, liking, retweeting my stories on social media, and if they are creating original responses to or about my story. So that's an example of how you might create a KPI statement around one of your goals. And in terms of, and we can just quickly walk through some of these, you'll see. So for example, maybe you need to raise money. So you need to raise a certain amount of money for maybe a campaign, a fundraising campaign that's going on. So for a particular story, you might set an amount that you hope to use that story to raise against the larger goal amount. So if you can try to get that story in front of 15 people and you're going to try to move 10 of them to donate $25, there's a sort of a nice specific number you can attach to that. Or maybe you're trying to attract new members, and a particular story might have a goal to get 10 people to sign up for the newsletter, or lead a certain number of people to pledge a monthly donation. So these are all meaningful things that you can, for people to do, that you can then measure too. So you can know if you put out a particular story and you set this goal, you can sort of track if that has allowed them to engage with you in a particular way. In terms of metrics, that's another big question we get is, what types of metrics can we establish? What can we really use to evaluate the effectiveness of our communication? So if you're thinking through particular goals, you can set up a structure like this. You can establish a goal, connect the activity to that goal, and then these are some potential metrics that you might establish for that goal. So if you look at the top, and feel free, like Sean said, this is recorded and you can come back to it, but feel free to take a screenshot of this too if you cannot fast and furiously write it down, as I would not be able to do. So let's say your goal, again, is to increase awareness of your organization's mission and work, or your brand in general. So some popular activities, sharing content on social media, blog posts, or press releases. And then the metrics that you attach to those things are: how many likes did it get? Was this shared a number of times that's meaningful to us? Was it retweeted? Did that retweet lead to someone clicking through to a particular page view? And again, this is where analytics tools come in. So you might, Google is probably the easiest way to do this, and some of you probably have this capability established. So you can really spend some time playing around in that dashboard that Google offers to understand how people came to your site, or how they engaged with your content. How long did they spend on a page? And for more traditional media, of course, it's the number of outlets that your release picked up. And you can include in that not just the number of outlets, but then you can find out, okay, well, the Houston Chronicle picked it up and they have this many, X many people in circulation. And so you can really get specific to understand, well, we can understand that we reached potentially this entire audience. So again, feel free to take a screenshot or write this down. I'm going to go through the last one though too, because I want to reiterate that getting people involved, getting real people involved to show up is also important. So let's say you're trying to build champions for your organization, your cause. You're trying to find those people who can really go out there and be on the front lines in taking action. So you might create an event or some sort of convening with practitioners in your field, and then from that you can understand how many mentions the event got in the news or social media. You can track the attendees who showed up. You can also really pay attention to what they've committed to do. Maybe they've decided you've got a sign-up sheet and you've asked everyone to commit to a particular action. Then you can say we've got 10 people, 15, 50, 100 people who have committed to volunteering, to donating, to writing a letter to a member of Congress about our issue. Another question we get a lot is, how do I really set realistic goals for these KPIs based on that strategy? And it's important to keep that in mind, that you don't want to shoot so high that you can't achieve it and that you've set yourself up for failure. But you want to give yourself something to work toward. So I think that it's really important to experiment to understand what's right for you. As I said at the top, there really isn't a one-size-fits-all universal solution for everyone, especially when you're talking about social networks. As these networks have expanded, we all know that they change very quickly, and something like the way something is retweeted or the algorithm that prioritizes things, these are all factors that we have to work through when we're distributing our stories. So those technical things, but then also just general human things. An audience response really could vary based on the platforms that you're using, the time that it's sent out, what else people are doing online at the time with their time. So you can use your KPIs to really fine-tune that material that you're producing and really find that sweet spot of the optimal results for you based on your audience and their engagement. And so I think that, it's really important to set small goals and track that growth over time. Again, nothing too big and ambitious that you're going to set yourself up for failure, but something that you can really practically work against. These can be monthly goals tied to those overall objectives, and then you can set quarterly and annual benchmarks to really be tracking your progress. Additionally, you don't want to, again, this speaks to the nothing that's too ambitious. You don't want to expect instant success. And this really ties to what we've said too, in terms of the fluctuation of things. it's hard to really pin down what's going to work right off the bat. And it can take some time to really get to understand what your audience is going to respond to. So again, those monthly goals, but just in general, gradual and steady is the way to go. And really be easy on yourself. This is about pacing and learning. And this is a place where I really think that it can become stressful. It can become stressful because this is sort of where the rubber meets the road, and you oftentimes have to prove what you've done. And you don't want to put too much pressure on yourself. You want to be able to cut yourself some slack and really demonstrate that something somewhere is making a difference and breaking through. And so I think that, it's really, again, really important to cut yourself some slack. And it's also important to not too quickly abandon what you've got going on. If a story doesn't get lots of attention and another one does or doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean to abandon whatever you're doing. Remember that these results are going to fluctuate based on what and when you share and who you share it with and who actually sees it and how they respond. So there has to be some sort of consistency for you to be able to track those things over time. To that point about success, people really, the idea of going viral, that was something that was very big and that was everyone's goal, and for a long time. And I think we've really come to a different time where that's not really, you can't expect that. You can't expect that that's going to happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything about you and your content if you don't get a surge of attention around a particular story. Because of the way that because there's so much content now and people have altered the practices with which they engage, you can't really put that pressure on yourself to have one piece sort of explode and do all sorts of amazing things for you. It really is more about slow and steady and building a relationship with your audience and helping them and getting them what they're interested in having. So I would really encourage you to let go of that idea of going viral or having some huge success on your hands, especially right off the gate. Before we take a Q&A break, this is another question that we get often is, what should I do with the metrics I've tracked and collected? And again, we've sort of hinted at this, and you can, I think, get a real good idea of, once you get going, of how this works. But optimize your content. Again, don't abandon stories that haven't received as much attention as you like. Instead, pay attention to the ones that have. How can you enhance the ones that maybe didn't get as much attention? You might, again, over time, notice a trend in your audience. They might really prefer, blog posts. They might really prefer photo stories. So it's about that long view, really taking time to understand your audience and what they're responding to, and then optimizing your content based on those responses. I think now is probably a good time to do a little Q&A. And I'll turn it over to Sean to facilitate that. But I just want to reiterate, because I know that this is really can be a very stressful component of your communication strategy and storytelling. But it's really about pacing yourself. It's about taking your time, getting to know your audience, and not putting too much pressure on yourself.
Yeah, I could not emphasize that enough. This ought to be, in a strange way, for many of us who do not think that we do math for a living, this ought to be fun, because it's about getting feedback and understanding what's resonating, what's working. Tara asked a fantastic question, and it was the one I was going to ask you, so she's beat me to it. What are some good alternative measures to so-called vanity metrics or vanity measures? And Tim, maybe the first thing we could do is sort of unpack what we mean, or what you think we mean, when we say vanity metrics or vanity measures.
Sure. I'm going to take a guess, Tara, and you can type it in if I'm right. Are you talking about likes, retweets, favorites, that type of thing? I'm going to assume that's what it is. Yeah, okay, great. Yes, I spent some time in Hollywood, and so I know a little bit about vanity. Yeah, it's tough, and it's something that we work on too, because we'll put a post up. We might have a podcast, and it might get 3 or 4 likes. But when you go a little bit deeper into the Twitter metrics, what's available, you can see is that it may have only gotten 3 or 4 likes, but it went in front of 600 people. And that's, again, goes back to what I'm saying in terms of the way people's habits have changed. You know, I've actually stopped personally liking or anything on Facebook, Twitter, because I got really annoyed with the way that it was being used to advertise to me and the way that it was used to sort of predict my political preference or whatever that might be. And I started to see the algorithm doing all sorts of things that I was really uncomfortable with. So I just stopped engaging with it that way. So in order to really get a deeper view of what I'm doing, you have to pay attention to like whether or not I've seen it and whether or not I've clicked the link. And then if I've clicked the link, how much time I've spent on the page. So that's going to tell you, did I see it? Did it move me to want to learn more? And then did I spend enough time on the page to learn something? Did I spend enough time on the page to actually read it? And some of these things are going to be difficult to quantify because you can't sit down next to someone and see if they actually read it and give them a quiz to understand if they comprehended it. But it is about going a little bit deeper than likes and looking at how many people did it get in front of, how many organic views did it get, and then you can also, of course, always drop a little money into a particular piece of content that you think is important to push it out into a greater audience. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, Sean, on vanity.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're tempting because it's low-hanging fruit, right? And I think you're right. The way people are engaging on the internet, people are getting a little bit savvier about the fact that anytime you engage on something, you're filling some sort of a data profile on some server somewhere. I think most of us who aren't engineers don't have a real clear understanding of how that works, but we don't necessarily like it. I will say my own experience, prior to coming to the network, I lived in think tank land here in Washington, D.C. for a while. And so for us, in all of our communications, our goal was ultimately to help make or derail new policies or legislation or regulation. So for us, it was all about what's the long-term play? Like, what's the actual outcome that we're seeking? Less about what's the specific vehicle going to be doing for us. So for instance, could be we might have a policy idea, and a metric of success that we actually saw was at one point we had a really cool idea that we'd give everybody a receipt for your taxes. You know, you go to Starbucks, you buy a cup of coffee, you get a receipt. You spent $2-3, whatever. But most families, the biggest expense they're going to incur in any given year is the taxes they pay, unless they've bought a house or a boat or a car or some other big ticket item. Most people, the largest expenditure in any given year is their taxes. And frankly, most people have no earthly idea what happens to your taxes once it shows up in the Treasury, where it goes, how it's spent. We thought it was a really good idea for the IRS to give people what's called a tax receipt. And so our metric on communicating that idea out was that we wanted to have it in the State of the Union. And we built strategies and things to get it in front of President Obama. And sure enough, a couple of years back now, you may remember this, there was a State of the Union speech. And one of the things among the many that the president spoke to was this idea of instructing the IRS to start building a tax receipt. Unfortunately, it required legislation, and it hasn't happened yet. But that, for us, was our measure of success. We were really clear-eyed about the long-term goal, which was making a new law, changing the way the IRS operates, and hopefully informing people in a new and different way. And so we were less concerned about how many people in Congress opened a tweet or liked a tweet or that sort of thing. It was all actually about that longer-term prize. And I would challenge folks to maybe think in that way. We've got a couple other questions in here. Jillian says, are there any tips around measuring the quality of engagement? If we just wanted clicks, we'd start posting cat pictures. Yes. But we wanted those with influence reading and sharing our content. Sometimes their social media reach isn't a good measurement of their influence. IRL, I don't remember what that means. In real life, sorry, I don't speak internet super well. I think there was a question in there, but maybe I just got after it, Jillian, or do you want to expand on that? And Lori says, in terms of metrics, isn't awareness brand building a constant for most of us? And if yes, how do you measure awareness and brand building writ large? I know there's obviously a means to do that, Tim.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say for many, especially smaller organizations, yes, probably awareness and brand building is important. For larger organizations, that might not be a top priority. They might be looking at, and we're going to do a little BuzzFeed style quiz in a second. But I think that, yeah, for a small organization, absolutely, that's sort of going to be a constant that you always have to be looking toward. If you're a little bit bigger and you have a slightly higher awareness, you're going to be tracking other things, and you're going to really want to pay attention to what those next steps are in terms of reach and building your audience, building your membership, building volunteers. And I think there's another part to that question, but I'm blanking on it right this second.
I think it was just about how do we build brand awareness and brand building is a constant goal.
Sure.
Jonathan's question here.
Going back. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh
no, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the quality of engagement question too, just in terms of, it's why the call to action is really important, and I think this also speaks in general to the number of digital followers someone might have versus their in real life networks. That the call to action and what you're really pushing people to do is obviously one of the most important things, because again, getting your content out there and getting it seen, it's great and it's important for certain things, but at the end of the day, most of us are really trying to get people to act and to move in some sort of direction. So that's obviously very important to push people toward that petition or that donation button or that letter that you're trying to get them to take action on.
Yeah, I think another way to think about gathering metrics, this may seem a bit silly, and maybe it's actually just a bridge too far for many of us, but it's also, almost certainly, if you're doing storytelling, again, you have an audience in mind. It may be that there are ancillary audiences that you reach, not necessarily your clear or core intended audience, but if you know who your core audience is, sending them a survey and finding out, did this story work, or even sometimes doing sort of binary testing, if you had this or that. Another way to do it, and again, sometimes this feels like this could be really expensive, but there's ways to do this that aren't necessarily super spendy. Focus groups. It may be quite helpful to you to build a core group of people that you know are your supporters or regularly engage with you, and reach out and find sort of a core group of those folks. Is it 10 people? Is it 6? Is it 12? I don't know. But maybe ask them if they would be willing to be sort of a person who you could send an email to or hop on the phone and ask them some questions from time to time. We all tend to do that kind of stuff a lot when we're doing things like building websites, but I think it's equally important to find ways to have one-to-one conversations with our audience when we're telling stories and find out what resonates, or even more so, what doesn't, right? What's working for them, what doesn't, where are they, what are they looking for, and what else are they out there consuming? Because I think the other thing that we all have to be mindful of is no one's doing this in a vacuum. The person who's consuming your story or your content might have been 5 minutes earlier watching the World Series, and 10 minutes from now is going to be Christmas shopping for their kids on Amazon. These are distracted people. So finding ways to get clear indications that what you're doing is of value to them and that they want to continue to hear from it, they want more, and that it fits into the way they're living their lives is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, Sean. I'm going to add on to it. I'm going to back up and add on to it too. It's like, in any sort of research that you can do, any sort of research and champion building you can do. So yes, finding out, like, talking to people that are in your audience and understanding, hey, like, what do you like? What's working for you? What's not working for you? Getting that real in-person feedback, and that can take some of the guesswork out of it. And you can also, they can also become people that you can count on. So we think about this sort of expanding circle. So if you have someone who has 10 people that they'll share it with, and then you can count on them. They can make a commitment. Yes, I will share it. And then you can sort of build that little army of people that can spread it out. Then that's a good way to sort of build and enhance authentic engagement as well.
Yeah, and so as we were chatting, Jillian jumped back in to sort of refine her question. Says she's trying to get, how do we measure and track those who have influence beyond social media reach? But maybe that has to be done manually. And I actually think, Jillian, and Tim might be curious what you think, and everybody else, feel free to just hop in here. I'm no expert. Hop into the group chat. But my own sense is if you have a particular audience or narrow audience, of folks that you believe are influential. Maybe that's the leader of your board. Maybe that's somebody who is a very well-known, high-profile champion in your field or in your sector, the space, the issues you're working on. If you can find them and talk to them, that's helpful. And that's always possible. As the example I gave you, we weren't calling up Barack Obama and asking him if he liked our idea, but we had a pretty good idea of the folks who were talking to him and bringing ideas his way. And we were really clear about the team that was writing the State of the Union that year. And we made sure that at the end of the day, we were talking to them, that we were eliminating as many barriers as we could to ensure that our ideas got directly sent to them so it could be among the things under consideration. Is that helpful, Jillian?
Yeah, and I'll add on to that too. I think, again, it's going back to the idea of real people doing things and understanding who you know and what they can do for you. And this cuts across so much of communicating and campaigning and organizing. And I don't mean that in more of a like in a vain or self-serving way. It's like, who do you know that wants to help and has the capacity to help, and really talking to them. You make a really good point, because this idea of influence has really been, I think, sort of muddied and disrupted because of social media. You can have someone who has 50,000 followers on Twitter. Half of them they could have purchased, and so that's obviously not a good metric. But I think you're right. There's a lot of footwork and handwork that goes into finding those people and recognizing them. There are also tools, and if you want to reach out to me, I can help guide you to some of them, because I'm drawing a blank right now, and some of them are just personal referrals. But to understand who online actually has influence, because there's an emerging market of various tools to help sort this out, because it's so much of the influence, I'm using air quotes that you can't see, is fake, because people are inflating for their own personal gain. But there are people who really do get in front of certain types of people more often and more frequently and more effectively. And there are some ways that you can start understanding that. And again, I will make sure that the last slide stays up at the end so that you can grab my email if you want to reach out and ask some questions about that.
Let's take one more question, and then let's move back to the presentation. Stephanie asks, how do you evaluate that it was a specific story that pushed people to a certain action? How do you know that it was this and not that got them from here to there?
That is an excellent question. It's tough. It is tough, especially when people are all over the place and behind screens, and so many of these metrics are sort of sometimes dubious. I think that a lot of it has to do with following the trail and putting together various pieces of information. So that is the story that was published, the response to it. You can track the click to the link, and then you can track where someone went from that page. So you could create a trail for yourself that is indicative of the story was meaningful, because if you're talking about a specific thing, there might be a bigger, if you have something that does very well, and it'll be very clear to say, well, that did well, and then all of a sudden we saw a spike in donations or a bunch of people signed up, you can track that. But really it's about, I think this is going back to some of the more strategic stuff that we spoke about in previous webinars, making sure you have a content calendar so you know what you're publishing and when, and then you can look back and say, okay, well, we published this on Wednesday, and then on Wednesday afternoon through Friday, we saw an increase in traffic, and we raised $1,000. So it is about putting lots of different pieces together. I don't know, Sean, if you have any additional thoughts, but some of this ends up becoming a little bit of a detective work.
And some of it, yeah, I think that's right, Tim. I mean, in some of this, we're just going to all have to get comfortable that you're never going to know with any great precision. It was at that particular element, whether it's a story or something else, that was the inflection point. It may be that what you can say is that we don't know with any great precision that our thing was the singular influence on making a person take this action, but we know that if we hadn't done it, but it seems like a lot of people took this action, whatever that might be. So getting really clear on what the purpose is, right? But if you see that purpose coming to pass, it may be enough to be able to say, we believe we contributed. And again, that's not a good hard metric. I think one of the other things is, and I don't have a lot of experience here, so I'm fishing a little bit here, but I think there might be lessons for us to learn from folks in the publishing industry, in the book publishing industry, and also in the filmmaking industry. As a, for instance, how do you know that the Star Wars story, for instance, resonated? Well, my mom spent a heck of a lot on Kenner action figures in the weeks after I saw Star Wars in 1977. Yeah, I'm dating myself. But that was an indicator, I think, that story was particularly meaningful to me. There are probably ways for you to get after it.
I think also, we forget that we can, try to follow up with people too. So maybe it's about whatever action you've asked them to do. You ask a follow-up question, which is, hey, why'd you do this? What prompted you to give today? And if there's a way to work that into your giving platform or your newsletter, it's like people, they don't have to answer, and they might decide that that's an extra step that they don't want to take. But it doesn't hurt to give people the opportunity to say, oh, well, I read this story and I was deeply affected. It made me mad. It made me sad. It made me happy, and I wanted to support what you were doing. So there's just a simple question like that you could add in on the back end in some way. Might give you really helpful insights.
Yeah, another thing, and this is not really vanity metrics, I suppose, or maybe it is, but I don't know how many of you actually place social media buttons adjacent to a story so that someone has the ability to share it. Sharing feels to me like a little bit different than liking, because it's someone sort of taking ownership of it or standing behind it. It's also a great way to start seeing, kind of who folks are, who have actually places of influence where so-and-so shared it, and then you saw immediately 15 people who perhaps weren't in your orbit were suddenly exposed to it. They liked it or they shared it. That's just one example. But again, this is a big challenge. Seth has a question, and then we'll move forward. We really will. Is there literature on testing that's been done on storytelling? Also, want to add that there's probably times when people's stories should be shared and heard because their voices are underrepresented in society, even if we are clear about the quantitative outcomes. Excuse me. So, is there any literature, any resources out there?
I would absolutely lift up and second that last part. And oftentimes, honestly, it is the story that we aren't expecting or that we don't think that might do well that does very well. And there's plenty of, going back to the entertainment industry and publishing, there's plenty of stories there where there's, especially today, especially the way our society and culture is changing today, it is more important than ever to really lift up those types of stories, and they're gaining traction. So that's actually, I think, a really important point to think about when you're creating your content is sometimes it is those unheard stories that really might catch on in a way that you don't expect. In terms of literature on testing, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but please feel free, again, take down my email address at the end, and I'm happy to follow up with you.
Okay, why don't we move forward? Edith has a really fabulous note in here for everybody in the chat box. I would recommend that you take a look at that, some of the work that's happening over at UNICEF. Really interesting insight to share. But why don't we move forward? And Jeff, I think you have a question in here. We'll get to that at the next break. Tim, you want to take it away?
Great. So what I wanted to do now, I wanted to run you through a little bit of a quiz that we do, and you might not be able to answer all of these questions right now. You could take a guess, or again, you can jot down or screenshot or look up the video later, the questions to answer accurately. But we put together this little assessment for some of our clients so that they could sort of scale themselves and see and give themselves some benchmarks to sort of work toward. So I'm going to walk through each one of these questions, give you a second to think and jot something down, and then I'll give you the grid where you can sort of compare, and then we'll do a final round of questions. So the first one is to think about your organization's email list, and rank yourself here based on what you have or what you think you have. So if you have less than 1,000 subscribers, give yourself 2 points. If you have 100 to 500,000, give yourself 5 points. If you have 500,000 or above, give yourself 10 points. And these are not weighted based on who is better. It's just a simple little weighting tool. And again, if you don't know, guess or come back to it. Second, how established is your digital presence? So you could think about your channels in total and take an average, or you could think about your oldest channel. So if you're less than a year old, give yourself 5 points. 1 to 4 years old, give yourself 10 points. If you've been around the digital world for more than 5 years, give yourself 15 points. Next, thinking about your staff. Do you have dedicated communication staff, or are you a program person who has to find the time to do the work? So if you don't have communication staff, give yourself 0 points. If you do, give yourself 10 points. Does your organization have a dedicated social media team? Again, if it's other comms people who are having to find the time in their day to do social media, then give yourself 0 points. But if you have people who know this stuff and who do it well, give yourself 5 points. And then tally them. And if you are under 20 points, then we're going to say that your goal is growing engagement. If you are between 20 and 29 points, we're going to say that your goal is establishing engagement. And if you are 30 points or above, we're going to say that your goal is strengthening engagement. And again, just sort of, if you don't know exactly, just sort of guess where you might fall, and keep this in mind. So growing engagement, establishing engagement, or strengthening engagement. And then we're going to take a look here and see each category. This is generally what you might want to strive for. So if you scored in the growing engagement category, you're going to want to think about a 17% open rate. So for email messages. For website visits, you're going to try to look for a 9% increase in visitors per month. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that says per month and annually. I think that you can sort of modify for this for what is best for you. If you're on Facebook, growing engagement is probably about getting up to $10,000 to $20,000, $30,000. That can be followers. That can be an aspirational goal for you, and you want to be around 4% post engagement. On Twitter, you're going to look at around 10,000 followers and a 1.6% tweet engagement. So again, notice this, because a lot of people will go, oh, I only have 1.6% engagement on Twitter. That's terrible. Well, not necessarily. It depends on what your goal is, right? So growing engagement, 1.6 is going to look pretty good to you. In the establishing engagement section, again, we're going to look at about 15%. This is about establishing and maintaining what you've got. You're going to want to look at about 15% increase in visitors per month to your website. And on Facebook, we're talking about 40,000 fans, around 5% engagement. So that's just the slightest bump from if you're growing. That's just from 4 to 5%. On Twitter, 15,000 followers, and again, the same engagement, because this can be one of the trickier. I think Twitter can be one of the trickier platforms. And then if you scored strengthening, we're going to talk about 15% open rates for your emails, 1% increase in visitors per month or annually, depending on how you need to rank that. And then on Facebook, that's about 150,000 fans, 5.5% post engagement, and 20,000 followers. Now, this is just, I don't say this, this is just a general tool. This is really going to depend on your organization and who you're trying to reach. And it can vary based on your field and what your emphasis is too, because we find that various environmental groups might see different suggested rates, or if you're working on issues of healthcare, you might see different rates. You might be aiming for different rates there too. And it also depends on what's happening, politically. Particularly right now, if you're working on an immigration issue or a healthcare issue, because that's what the media tells us is most important right now. You might expect different types of engagement rates and different types of metrics for evaluation. So that's just, again, nothing. This should not be stressful, because as Sean said, this is often fluctuating, and we all are learning from each other. But that's sort of a general idea of what you might aspire toward. So I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to put my email address up there in case some of those questions about research on storytelling, or if I've not answered anything completely to your satisfaction and you want to hound me about that, that's my email address. I'm happy to take a few more questions as well. Not enough staff. That's a great. You're right. We should add that to our assessment.
All right, and if we could put up the Q&A again, just so everybody can see what we're doing, because I know some folks are on the phone and also on the device.
Oh yeah.
Jess's question was, what kinds of updates do you suggest sharing with your board, et cetera, from month to month? Growth in impressions, for instance, every month is probably not sustainable. So I guess this is a question both for you, Tim, but I'd also put this out to the group. How do you all share your storytelling progress with your staff, with your bosses, or with your board? And maybe put that into the chat box so we can all learn what each other are doing. But Tim, you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's really depends on your goals and what you need to report back to your board on. So I would say really tying what you report back to organizational goals and to KPIs. And again, those KPIs really create the great measurement points in terms of what those numbers are that you're reporting, and especially if you have maybe a senior level communications person that you're working with, you might really want to make sure that you've reported back to them and they're clear on all those goals, and so that's something that you've decided internally that has to go to the board. But I think that again, it really depends on your goals, but and how your organization works. But just generally having my own personal opinion is that having a quarterly look at how things are doing is important. It's just because, especially when you're busy doing other stuff, we try to take a quarterly look ourselves at how we're doing. So that's what we use, and I think that's a good natural point in the calendar to sort of give yourself that checkpoint.
What I might add in here, and again, I'd love to hear what folks think and how they do this in their orgs inside the chat box. But one thing I think that you might want to keep in mind, if you were with us in San Francisco at ComNet 18 just a couple of weeks back, we gave out the first ever Clarence B. Jones Impact Award. And I guess I'm patting, sorry, a little bit of a plug there, but we gave it to the Truth Initiative, which I'm guessing is an organization that's known to many of you. What you may not know is their impact. And if you ask them what they do, they're a storytelling organization. Their entire purpose is to tell the story about the dangers of tobacco to young people. And they earned the Jones Impact Award because of what they've done over the last decade or two. The teen smoking rates in the United States have declined from, I believe it was about 26%. So a little over 1 in 4 kids that you would meet were teenagers that smoked a cigarette or were smokers. That rate is now down at about 6%. And unfortunately, because what's old is new again, the challenge before them now is both opioids, but also Juuls, these smokeless cigarettes, vaping, is a new challenge. But the takeaway, I think, when the judging committee was evaluating some of the folks for that award, one of the big takeaways was, gosh, Truth had this tremendous impact, but they were not home run hitters. It took them over 20 years to see those kinds of reductions, and I think that's perhaps a lesson. And I heard some folks in here in the chat box talking about behavior change. That's a place, particularly when you're talking to your board, which really ought to have a strategic eye towards the future, is it's not about what are you doing month over month, but like how are you actually measuring year over year, or in the case of Truth, decade over decade, because I think that's where you're going to see progress. I think expecting one single home run story to do it all for your organization or on any given quarter is probably unrealistic, given all the other variables and vectors that are involved in getting ideas out into the world. Now, Maria says here, normally I do a bi-monthly report about increases and decreases in followers and likes and reach of engagement and the most popular and engaged posts on each platform, talking about social media here. And then she tries to model future content on what's performing best And for us, that's normally events and conferences, in-office happenings, etc. You guys can read it here, but Hope Lab is focused on strengthening engagement. I believe that's where Maria is from, is at Hope Lab. Other thoughts that people have here, feel free to jump in, or questions for that matter, questions you might have for Tim. And if it feels a little bit like, guys, there's no clear one-stop shopping answer, and if that's what you were hoping for out of this hour, I'm sorry to disappoint you. The truth is, there is no magical pill or answer here. There's trying to evaluate storytelling is really tethered, I think, to long-term strategic goals. And the best you can probably try to figure out is, are you making progress, or are you starting to see declines? Another thing I've seen or I've heard folks do is, and I'm sure many of you have this as your practice, is recycling content. Finding out if the stuff that's new is resonating, or if there are stories that perhaps are sitting in your story bank, hopefully you have one, but things that you recycled, that you brought out that resonate because they happen to be sort of in the zeitgeist, they're in the moment. That story about the elections from a couple of years back is suddenly relevant again because of the election cycles, for instance. But how much are you able to match your storytelling to the moment, I think, is really interesting, and being able to see old content versus new, if that's a way that you operate, that might be another thing to look at. Tim, other thoughts, maybe some closing thoughts as we start to get to the top of the hour here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate that. I know that sometimes this topic can be sort of unsatisfying because of just the nature of it. But I think that it's really important for communicators like ourselves to in this portion, understand the environment and the landscape, and work to understand our audience and find out what is best and works well for them. And that might mean doing a little bit of homework on them, and like we've talked about previously, doing some research and creating your own little informal focus group or your informal team of champions to go to. But I think it's really important, again, in this really competitive media age, to cut yourself some slack and to just take a deep breath when it comes time to evaluate. And to know that you're really, that sometimes you won't know the impact, and unfortunately that we have to live with that sometimes, but really finding the ways, the things you can know and can measure well, and just keep those in mind and optimize your content as best you can along the way.
Let's take one more question before we close. Stephanie asks, how can you show that stories themselves are illustrating impact, especially when thinking of fundraising? How can stories actually illustrate the impact of your organization, and how do you know that that's working?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's some of this is, again, not to offer a vague answer, but some of this is rooted in the research on storytelling, and I know sometimes we have to make pitches to people to convince them of this, but there's really great research, and some of it is in the previous webinars that we've done on the power of storytelling and what it can move us to do. And so when you really, and this is why we really love this platform, the Storytelling for Good platform, is that it walks you through all of those pieces to really think through strategically what has been proven by various research points, and even in our own work with our clients to work. And so thinking through that story strategically from the beginning, your goals, and then really making sure you have a strong call to action. That's sort of the why we designed this whole program, is to really convince and convey the importance of storytelling and demonstrate why it works, and then offer people the means to start building those stories. And again, in terms of fundraising, I think a lot of it comes back to looking at what you're doing and why you're doing it, and what you see happen after, in line with your content calendar, with your KPIs, and then what's happening in terms of your giving. So again, I know unfortunately not always a satisfying answer, but I would recommend you take a look at the whole storytelling platform, because there's a lot of really great points throughout to address some of these questions about stories and how they work and why they matter.
And just so you see there, Stephanie, we actually pulled up the website again. It's storytelling.comnetwork.org. Tim is exactly right. Within every one of the interactive lessons, there are some guideposts that will probably help you shape your story in a way that we think will be most useful and offer you some guideposts to create evaluations along the way. And then, of course, there's some really, really fabulous, you can see right here, people and goals. The strategy piece, I think, is at the outset, before you start even crafting the story, getting really clear on these things. But then down below, you'll see some articles about strategy. These are things we would really hope that you all would avail yourselves of. They're fabulous, written by our colleagues and peers. Some really smart people contributed, so please do take advantage. I'm afraid we are out of time, so I just want to say thank you again to Tim and the team at Hadaway. You've been wonderful partners helping us build Storytelling for Good. It's a resource that's available to you and to others, so feel free to please, by all means, share it. Tristan and I have the ambition of coming back next year with sort of a 201 version of Storytelling for Good series of webinars. So if there are particular questions that you would love to see answered, you can type them into the chat box here. We're going to be sending out a survey to a number of you soon, trying to find out what you might be interested in learning about in the coming year. And we will be back again with another webinar on negative narratives. I believe that's next week. Is that right? Okay. So look for us in your inboxes pretty soon. Thanks for everybody for being with us today, and be well. We'll talk to you again very, very soon.